participants and some of the program participants. And let me start this event by first introducing our director, who is Larus Tolasius. And he will say a few words about Nordita. And then we'll start with the program. Larus, please.
So, I'm going to start by wishing you all a warm welcome to Nordita and to Stockholm. So Nordita is the Nordic Institute for Theoretical Physics. It's located here in Stockholm, but actually for most of its history it was in Copenhagen. It was started in the late 1940s at the premises of the Niels Bohr Institute. And in fact, back then, it was started actually to replace the theory division of CERN, which originally was in Copenhagen, but then was moved to Geneva to be closer to the experimental institute. And then you could say, as compensation to Niels Bohr and his colleagues, the Nordic countries got together and started this institute. And back then it was called the Nordic Institute of Theoretical Atomic Physics, and the atomic only the A at the end of our acronym, Nordita. But then over the years, of course, the scope of activities at the institute has broadened beyond atomic physics. We do, basically, today we do research, even though we're a small institute, we do research across most of theoretical physics. So, basically, there was some shifts in the political landscape some years ago that led to the institute being moved to Stockholm. Throughout most of its period in Copenhagen, it was owned and operated by a political body called the Nordic Council of Ministers. They then wanted to move out of the business of owning institutes and rather just supporting them partially, and that's what they do today. We get about half of our budget from the institute. And then back and forth, eventually it was decided that the institute would move to Stockholm. And we've been building up since then, and are by now more or less fully operational. It's not a very large institute. We have a very small faculty, less than 10 professors and assistant professors, and then another 10 postdocs or so. We are engaged in research over like I said, a rather broad range of topics in theoretical physics, astrophysics, biological physics, condensed matter physics, statistical physics, high energy theory, some nuclear physics, and probably leaving something out here. But we managed to, I think, cater to a much larger audience and a larger public by running programs and workshops and schools like the one we have here. And the programs are normally things we run for about a month at a time, and we bring in people from all over to work on a specific area or even specific topics for that period of time. And this allows us to, I think, be relevant to a much larger cross-section of the scientific community. We're putting a lot of effort into this. We're focusing about a quarter of our resources into this program. Now, this part of the program here now is a school, and this is also our old Nordita tradition. Nordita summer and winter schools have been run for decades now. In fact, most people have their first Nordita experience or exposure to Nordita through school, certainly myself included. Some while ago, I went to school in astrophysics in northern Norway. I was run by Nordita. And so I gather from that most of you are probably not been here before, so especially welcome those of you that you enjoy your stay and find it profitable, but also, of course, those of you who are returning, and welcome back. I don't think I will go on extolling the virtues of our institute. Let me get on with your business here today. So, again, welcome and success this time.
Thank you, Larus, and sorry for mispronouncing your name. There will be a few more details details that I will be telling you while we go on. First of all, let me note that we will be taking recordings of these lectures. So C.K. Sean, who's sitting over there at the back, is taking care of the camera. If anybody feels very much against being oneself on the camera, because normally we will try to have these movies available later on the web. Please let me know in advance if posting them is okay with everybody. Secondly, we will have lunch tickets for all those who are registered at the school. That normally does exclude the people who are registered in the program. Those indeed are typically here for a longer period of time, and they get a deal. Those people who are here for 3 weeks. So that explains why not everybody has a lunch ticket. But I hope additional lunch tickets as we go on. But otherwise, you are all welcome to join us downstairs. We have a designated area in the level 3 where we will all have lunch after 12:30. Normally, our daily program is such that we will have 3 lectures in the morning with 2 short coffee breaks, and then we have a longer coffee break, half an hour in the afternoon. The lunch break is 1.5 hours. Bathrooms are just around the corner over here, but also in level 4. And to remind you, the restaurant is in level 3. So with this, let us begin with the first lecture by Olivier Legrand. Please.
Good morning, everyone. So, I'm going to give Pavel Sakov and I'm going to give 20 lectures on assembly and definition of observations. It has originated from meteorological and oceanographical applications. Actually, assimilation is not a problem that is specific meteorology and oceanography, but it turns out that for reason which I'm going to describe, it was studied particularly in the Well, I know you have different backgrounds, and I would like to know a little more about the state of knowledge on this problem. Who among you can say they already know rather well assimilation? I go to the other end. If I speak, for instance, of a covariance matrix, who knows well what a covariance matrix is? Okay, not all hands are already. So I think I spent some time explaining a few basic fundamental concepts and notions. Well, so my first part is assimilation of observations, the case of meteorology and oceanography, inverse problems, Bayesian estimations. I'm going to say a number of things, and this will take one very little time. And since I'm going to speak about meteorological applications, I'll first comment this picture, well, example picture that is scanned. The quality is not very good. This is an example, an early example of what is called an ensemble forecast produced by the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts. The center is a joint center of something like 30 European countries. There are two different kinds of, there are four member states, member countries. There are, I think, now 18 or 19 of them, plus 10 or 12 associated countries. Not all are European. Morocco is associated, the second member. Israel is now. And this center, which is located in Reading, in Great Britain, has been producing daily forecasts since daily 10-day forecasts since 1979. And in late 1992, so almost 20 years ago, they started producing ensemble predictions. What they have, and I'm going to say a few words about that later, is a huge numerical model which numerically integrates the equation, the physical laws which govern the evolution of the flow from observed initial conditions. And the problem of simulation is the problem of defining those, when I say observed initial conditions, from initial conditions which have been produced through an assimilation process of physical time. And as everyone knows, meteorological forecasting and variable prediction is not very easy, and it is very important to try and assess a priori the uncertainty of the forecast, and that is why ECMWF started ensemble forecast, in which forecasts, it is not produce one forecast from one set of initial conditions, but a number of forecasts from a set of different initial conditions, which are supposed to sample the initial uncertainty so as to produce forecasts which hopefully will sample the initial uncertainty and the future forecasts. And these are, I think there are 32 of them. At that time now there are 50 of them. At that time there are 32 forecasts. At the range of 168 hours, that makes 7 days. And if you looked at the corresponding the area represented on each of these scans, first estimate is the Western Europe. Britain, Great Britain is here, Spain is here, we are here, and it goes here to, you see, for instance, here, the Black Sea and Iceland. The model is global, it covers the whole volume of the atmosphere. But if you looked at the corresponding initial conditions, as you are sitting in your room, you will not see the differences between the various initial conditions. What we got to do is have to look at the contour lines in detail to see the differences. And at 7 days, you'll see that the forecasts are pretty different. The quantity that is represented here is the 500 hectopascal geopotential, that is the altitude, the geometric altitude geopotential of the surface pressure with value 500 hectopascal. That is approximately the level which divides the depth of the atmosphere into 2 layers of equal masses. And in Europe, this altitude is typically 5,500 meters. And so, at the range of 7 days, the forecasts are pretty different. And even if you don't know much of meteorology, you will certainly be convinced if I tell you that these two forecasts are totally different. These are so lines of isogeopotential at the given surface pressure because of the geostrophic balance, of which I'll say much more later. These also almost coincide with the lines of the flow. That is the wind, except in area of strong curvature, the wind follows those lines. And see, this corresponds to a flow coming from the Atlantic Ocean into Europe, and this corresponds to the month of January to a mild, very dull, cloudy weather, very ordinary weather of this time of the year. This corresponds here to a center of high pressure over Scandinavia, and this corresponds to a flow going around the center. This means a cold flow of air over Germany, that is a very hot spell in this area. So these are two totally different forecasts from initial conditions, which I tell you would be indistinguishable if you looked at them as you are sitting in the room. I've taken this old example because at the time ECMWF did answer the forecast by perturbing only the initial conditions. Now they perturb also the model itself. So I showed this in order to show the sensitivity to initial conditions. Well, this incidentally is what was observed at the time of the prediction. And you'll see that some of these predictions are rather similar to that, while others are not at all. But the exercise of comparing the ensemble elements to what was observed at the range is futile. This is just a sample of the sentence. Not the problem is not to determine whether this or that particular forecast, unless it has been made using a particular procedure, was more accurate than another forecast. So probably the problem is to determine statistically, but can be not only statistically, whether the spread and the ascendancy described by that ensemble is in a sense correct. For another example, more recent, but which contains perturbation not only of initial conditions but also of the model itself. This is relative to the prediction, to the situation of the case of Hurricane Katrina, which hit New Orleans on the 29th of August 2005. So this is again an ensemble prediction. Now there are 50 of them, and it is, I think, the range is 3 days and a half, and this is, okay, this is the observed situation at the time when the hurricane hit New Orleans, and you see that among those 50 forecasts, some of them do predict a hurricane in a mile, which is even about the position of New Orleans, while others don't predict a forecast in that area. So all this shows the very high sensitivity of meteorological predictions to initial conditions and also physical parameters. This is the celebrated butterfly effect of Edward Lenz. A butterfly flaps its wings, and this results in cyclone occurring or not occurring 5 days later somewhere in the ocean. And this sensitivity of meteorological forecast to initial conditions was actually identified at a very early time, and the mathematician Henri Poincaré, more than 100 years ago, wrote the following sentences. Why have meteorologists a difficulty in predicting the weather with any certainty? Why is it that showers and even storms seem to come by chance, so that many people think it is quite natural to pray for them, though I would consider it ridiculous to ask for an eclipse-like prayer? A tenth of a degree more or less at any given point, and the cyclone will burst here and there, and extend its ravages over districts that it would otherwise have spared. If they had been aware of this 10th degree, they could have gone in a different hand, but the observations were neither sufficiently comprehensive nor sufficiently precise, and that is the reason why it proceeds due to these conditions. Perfect statement of the sensitivity of meteorological prediction to initial conditions. So, what do meteorologists have at their disposal to define the initial conditions of the of the meteorological process. First, of course, the observations. And I'm going to briefly describe the observing system as it is at present. I'm going to show a few maps which show the spatial distributions of the observations received by SEM&WF over a 6-hour period centered on 23rd on April, a few days ago, around 0 duties. This has surface observations performed in meteorological stations around the world, as well as a number of ships. And these observations, well, they're on temperature, wind, humidity, and pressure. As long as meteorological prediction is concerned, it is by far pressure which brings most information. The other variables may be very sensitive to local conditions and may usually not so useful for weather conditions. Of course, these observations are concentrated over areas, inhabited areas relatively wealthy countries, but there are very large areas, like for example the Southern Pacific, which are almost devoid of observations. Another type of observations, which bring much more observations, are radio sounding instruments into a balloon, which ascends through the atmosphere, measuring pressure, humidity, and temperature. The balloons, the motion of the balloons is followed in some way, which gives an information of the wind, and again, you see that the observation, which again bring much more information, the surface observations are located mostly on the continents of the northern hemisphere, leaving again very large areas for observation. These are observations made by aircraft, commercial flights, of course. Most of them are done only at one level, and of course, where there are planes, there are commercial flights. This is another type of information, now the most important of all, made by satellite, which on a total orbit, which measure the infrared radiator flux coming out of the atmosphere. This infrared radiator flux is a complex which is measured in a number of channels, a number of wavelengths, and is a complex function of the emission of the surface, either the continent or the ocean, and the temperature and humidity profile from the atmosphere. They are measured in a number of different wavelengths, but in each wavelength, the measurement is a complex combination of the parameters I just mentioned. So there is a kind of inverse problem to be solved in order to be able to transform these observations into temperatures, humidity, which are the quantities which meteorologists are interested in. You know that at this time, a number of satellites, such satellites are in orbit, and over a 6-hour period, they are capable of covering the observations, are capable of covering almost all of the atmosphere. The observations are denser in high latitude, just because the orbits overlap, swaths of the orbits overlap in high latitude, or they don't fully overlap in lower latitude. These are satellite observations of another kind, performed by geostationary satellites at an altitude of 6,000 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. 5 such satellites are sufficient to cover the whole equatorial band, and on the 23rd of April, only 4 of them sent observations for some technical reasons. These in particular were information of the motion of wind for the observed motion of clouds, which is determined partly, not only partly, conditioned uniquely by wind, and bring information of wind. There are basically 2 types of satellites used in meteorology. Either satellites in low altitude polar orbits, the one I showed before, at an altitude of typically 1,000 kilometers, and geostationary satellites. Of course, geostationary satellites are used for another purpose, which is telecommunication. And I'll speak in a few minutes of a third type of satellite, which starts being used in meteorology. Oh, these are GPS measurements, satellites of the GPS system, which are used for localizing objects in the surface of the Earth. And it turned out that actually after the satellites were launched, the Earth, the satellite, the position of which is perfectly known with very much accuracy, a signal received by a station at the surface of the Earth, or a signal received by a station at the surface of the Earth or another satellite. The path of a signal is usually curved, and the curvature is a function of temperature and humidity. So what we have here, whenever such a measurement is made, simply the angle between the direction separating the two receivers, emitters and receiver, and the observed direction of the incoming signal gives an information which is an integral of essentially temperature and humidity along the path of the signal. And again, in order to transform that into a meteorologically significant signal, it is necessary to solve some kind of inverse problem. And these GPS measurements, which are presented still in a relatively small number, 66 of them over the 6 hour periods, are considered as potentially being able of bringing much useful information on the atmosphere, on temperature and atmospheric humidity. So, this is a brief description of the meteorological observing system and of the observations which make the first part of the information that is available to meteorologists to start the process. The number of such observations are increased very significantly in the last years because of satellite observations. And I don't have a figure for now, but 1 year ago, there were 55 million scale observations, that is scalar quantities, per 24-hour period. While in the late 90s, the number of observations was much lower than 1 million. So the number has very substantially increased in the recent years. And, well, I'll say more about that in 2 minutes. What about oceanography? These are the traces of satellites which measure the altitude, the height of the surface of the ocean, simply by measuring the time taken by signal emitted by satellite and reflected by the surface of the ocean to go back to the satellite. Satellite fly over the continents that's useless. And we're able, taking account waves and tides and all that, to measure significant, what is considered a significant signal in the height of the ocean, to the accuracy, which I found absolutely amazing, of 2 centimeters. And this accuracy of the observation of the height of the surface of the ocean is useful because the surface of the ocean is modulated by the circulation in the ocean. If, for instance, have a motion this way in the ocean, then the Coriolis force in the northern hemisphere acts to the right of the motion, and through the geostrophic motion, the pressure gradient balances the proximity of the geostrophic, which shows that the pressure is increased in this direction, which means that the height of the ocean must be here higher than that. So, the measurement of the height of the surface of the ocean brings integrated information about the motion in the atmosphere in the depth of the ocean. The ocean is very difficult to observe. It is very difficult to observe because it is totally opaque to any form of electromagnetic radiation. If you want to know what's going on in the ocean, you must either make measurements like this one, which are in a sense a space integral or something, or to go invert the ocean with instruments to make measurements. This is done, but it's very costly. Another type of measurement of the ocean is provided by tomograph measurements. That is, measurement of the time necessary for a sound signal to propagate from an emitter to a receiver, and that is the motion taking into they both are equal to a combination of motion of the mean average motion of the ocean between those 2 points and the celerical sound, and from the celerical sound, one of the measurements of the temperature. And except for that variation, the only way now to observe the ocean is to send probes within the ocean, which make measurements, and then which go to the surface, emit, send the quantities that are measured to a satellite which flies over, or which flies over. Then the probe goes down again and makes new measurements. But all that is extremely costly and dynamic. And the ocean is much less well known than the atmosphere, but basically the same problem arises in the cellular ocean as in the Earth. And then, what is the second piece of information that is available for meteorologists to start to forecast? Well, that is basically, of course, the physical laws which govern the evolution of the flow. Conservation of mass, which determines the time evolution of density, conservation of energy, which determines the time evolution, which governs the time evolution of internal energy, temperature in the case of perfect gas, conservation of momentum, which determines the evolution of the velocity of the fluid, which is always taken in the frame of reference linked to the rotating Earth, so that inertial forces, and in particular periodic force, have to be taken into account. And then with quantity, this gives the evolution of the density, the evolution of the internal energy. Here, the gradient of the pressure appears in the momentum equation. Then there will be an equation of state which relates to 3 quantities. And then there is also evolution of the secondary components. Water in the atmosphere. The water exists in the atmosphere under its 3 phases. The 3 solid, liquid, and gaseous phases. A secondary component of the ocean is the salt, which has a very important effect because it changes the density of the fluid. For instance, the upper layer of the ocean, because of the evaporation, becomes denser than lower layer. Then a convective motion which will occur, in which surface water will go down, will go down into the ocean, and lighter water will come from deeper layers. And now, chemical species, like for instance, ozone in the atmosphere, are introduced in the model. So there are additional equations for governing the evolution of mass and secondary components. And in practice, all these physical laws are available in the form of discretized and necessarily imperfect numerical models. So these are basically the 2 sources of information that meteorologists have: observation and numerical model. Well, we see an example of discretization of numerical model. I present the ECMWF, of which I was speaking a few minutes ago, uses a numerical model was horizontal discretization. Is based on discretization value. It's not a great point in discretization. Not entirely. Part of the model uses spectral representation built spherical harmonics with, this is very technical, triangular condition 1279, which corresponds to an average horizontal resolution of 16 kilometers. It has 91 levels in the vertical, between 1 and about 80 kilometers of altitude, which makes about an average of 1 kilometer for each layer in the model in the vertical. Actually, the layers are denser, the layers are smaller depth, smaller in the lower atmosphere. And this makes a state vector, that is the number of parameters, the evolution of which is explicitly computed in time in the course of a prediction, of 1.5 10 to the 9. So that's the dimension of present large numerical values used for numerical overprediction. And just to complete, brief comment, what I've just said, this represents the evolution of the performance of the forecasts performed at ECMWF since when we started on the daily basis in 1989, and the quantity, years, and the quantity which are represented here is what is called it is essentially a correlation coefficient. I'm not going to go into detail. For the northern correlation coefficient, for prediction of 500 hectopascal geopotential, the same quantity I showed in the first slide, and it says northern hemisphere extrotropics, yes, bottom, but what is northern hemisphere? If you're up top, the top is not in my slide. And this coefficient, perfect forecast will be 100, are steadily increased over time. It is considered that forecasts are useful when the coefficient is larger than 60%. That was reached in 1979 after 4 days of forecast, and now it is 5, 6, it is reached 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, after almost 8 days of forecast. So what's the prediction? 4 days in 30 days. 4 days. Quality of the forecast. The reduced range of the forecast has increased by 4 days in 30 days. This is 500 geopotential, 500 hectopascal geopotential, which describe the large-scale motion and also temperature structure from the geostrophic balance of the atmosphere. It does not describe necessarily the details of humidity fields or wind at the surface of the Earth, which is what really matters for the ordinary user of meteorology. Surface parameters are more difficult to predict, except surface pressure, are more difficult to predict. And they are in progress over the years. Maybe if you're interested in education in some regions. But still, there are significant incentives in the prediction of surface parameters, which are much more sensitive to local effects and to many processes which are not well described in the large by the large motion.
What does the dips correspond to?
Beg your pardon?
What does the dips correspond to? Is it changes of
what does happen to it?
So, in 3 lowest curves, you have a very sharp dip there. It becomes worse. Do they change the?
This?
Yeah.
Yes. This. I can tell you that at the time, people were very concerned by this significant decrease in the quality of the forecast. Actually, I know that at least you may believe that. These models are in constant evolution. Modifications are constantly made of them. And at that time, they thought that one recent change in the model might be because of the decrease of quality. That wasn't the case. Actually, this one was covered. So in other models, in other methodologies, it may have been due but I don't know whether it has been very identified, to an El Nino event which occurred at the Barrier Time, which have put the atmosphere in a state of circulation which is slightly different from what the model had been tuned to, in a sense, because in the model, of course, they are based on the physical laws which govern the flow, but there are, in a sense, a number of parameters that are tuned in order to ensure that the simulation is as close as possible to what the observer can say. So this may have been an El Nino event, you know, that El Nino event which happens Eastern Pacific Ocean, in which warm water replaces cold water along the coast of Southern America, and which have been observed relatively recently to have effect on a large proportion of the population. But I'm not sure whether this has been very generous, the difference has been fully identified. Okay, so I come now to assimilation. The purpose of assimilation is to reconstruct as accurately as possible the state of the atmospheric or oceanic flow using all available appropriate information. And that information essentially consists of the observations proper, which vary in nature, in resolution, and in accuracy, and are distributed more or less regularly in space of time. And second, of the physical laws governing the evolution of the flow, available in practice in the form of a discretized and necessarily approximate numerical model. There is other information. For instance, it is known that in middle latitude, the flow is in approximate geostrophic balance. The coherence force approximately balances the pressure moving force. And this balance, of course, is a necessary consequence of the physical laws I've described, the asymptotic property of a system in which both internal dissipation and forcing due to solar heating occur simultaneously, and a kind of long-term attractor in the system. And this attractor, which represents the combined effect of forcing due to solar heating and internal dissipation, and this attractor has the property to correspond to approximately geostrophic flows, and although again, this geostrophic balance is a consequence of this physical. In fact, if you take a model, a numerical model, and you start it from conditions which have nothing to do with geostrophic balance, the model will by itself progressively reconstruct geostrophic balance. So, what do you say? It is embedded in the physical laws. You don't have to explicitly impose geostrophic balance. But still, since it is an asymptotic effect, it is useful to tell the assimilation system you're required to produce a state which is in approximate geostrophic balance. Right? That's right, obviously. But basically, two sources of information: observation on the one hand, physical laws on the other, available in the form of this without. Well, assimilation is one of many inverse problems that are encountered in many fields of technology, of science and technology. I would say an inverse problem is a problem in which one wants to estimate the state of the system, like be a physical system, biological system, economical system, wants to determine in which state member of the system is. And the available information is simply not in the proper format. It is not in the format it should be. The archetypal archetype or inverse problem is solid Earth geophysics. What is the state of the interior of the Earth? Almost all information we have about the internal state of the Earth, not all, but almost all, come from the observation of propagation of seismic waves. And seismologists have been able, simply by observing seismic waves, to determine to high degree of accuracy the internal state of the atmosphere, consisting of the solid mantle, so on the liquid core, and within the liquid bubbles, again, solid grain at the center of air, and all that without performing any in situ observations, of course, has been done mostly on the basis of the observation of seismic waves. So basically archetypical inverse problem. It has a great difference with meteorological problems, but in solid Earth geophysics, so far, Earth has been considered as being the Earth has been considered stationary. It doesn't equal its time. Now, geophysicists consider things like, for instance, plate tectonics and the connection between the motion of plates, mountains, and internal condition within the Earth, and start choosing methods which are more are similar to what we have. Another typical inverse problem is plasma physics. For instance, in the context of nuclear fusion, we want to do controlled fusion. There's a plasma, and we want to know the internal state of plasma. The only way to observe a plasma is to measure the electromagnetic fields it produces outside of the plasma itself. So for reconstructing the internal state of the plasma from external measurements of magnetic and electrical field. Typical inverse problem. Navigation is the problem of finding, identifying the exact position, velocity, and also orientation of an object with moving space. Even in I mean, that's problem. Navigation is visible now, mostly on the basis of Kalman filter, of which Pavel Sakov will speak later. And for all those problems, I say, but most often, the solution is based on probabilistic estimation. And that the basic mathematical equations, even practical implementation, and of course the vocabulary, are totally different. Now, so assimilation of meteorological and oceanographic problems of meteorological and oceanographic observations is an inverse problem. There are two difficulties which make it particularly difficult. First is the very large numerical dimensions of the problem to be studied. I mentioned the number of parameters is limited, and in the case of meteorology, the number of observations is available. And the difficulty, of course, is aggravated in the case of numerical recognition by the need for the forecast to be already in time. Basically, no right for a second try. Can perform to read the forecast, to evaluate the forecast. Maybe 1 in 100, not. And the second difficulty, as I told you, is that underlying dynamics is, to certain extent, non-structural. And it is necessary to use explicitly dynamics because the observations come constantly in time. Yes, I didn't mention that when I described the observing system. The observation which are made at the surface of the Earth and the recent observations by international convention, which dates back from before the development of numerical weather prediction, are performed at the same time at all meteorological stations on the Earth. These times are 0 and 12 Greenwich time, plus necessarily 6 and 1800 Greenwich time, all over the surface of the Earth. These are called synoptic observations, because it was considered necessary to have a kind of instantaneous picture of the circulation of the atmosphere at a given time. Of course, satellites make measurement continue at the same time, so the flow of satellite observations is continuous, and so it is necessary to take into account the evolution of the flow, that is, to use the computers in the very process of processing the information, processing the observations, in order to determine the initial conditions of the forecast to be done. Both observations and models are affected with some uncertainty, and very bad uncertainty. And as I said at the start, it is obvious, knowing the certainty of the estimate is necessary because in a problem of meteorology it is absolutely necessary to be able, it is highly desirable to be able to define, to specify, to a priori specify, quantify the uncertainty and the forecast in 3, 4, 5, or 10 days. And so it is necessary to know the uncertainty. And for some reason, uncertainty is fundamentally described by probability distributions. There is some almost metaphysical, some metaphysical considerations behind this statement. I once said to a French mathematician who knows very well stochastic differential equation, probability theory, that we use probabilities for describing uncertainty. No, probably not. He did not agree. Well, he was taken, I think he was taken, he was not expecting the chemist, but there is no doubt what we use probabilities for describing uncertainty, and it works. It was particularly well when it comes to this question. I have already an estimate of the state of the system described by probability distribution, and then new information comes in. And I want to update the predicted probability, the estimated probability with that new observation. I simply use Bayes' rule for conditions and probability. It works very well. And so assimilation is a problem in Bayesian estimation. Determine the condition and probability distribution for the state of the system, knowing everything we know, that is what we think is relevant to our problem. And if you want to more about this question, I mentioned the book, Tarantola. The first edition was published in 2005. Tarantola died last year, but a new version of this book was published something like 2 years ago. And all these questions are discussed in some detail. Tarantola was a geophysicist who became interested in estimation theory because of the problem of geophysics. Okay. So Bayesian estimation. I have here a few. What? Actually, I said it. 1 hour lecture. I intended to have to leave time for questions. So, okay.
Idea.
So I can start. There are a few minutes left. So if you have questions or comments, please.
Please, yeah.
I have a comment that the book by Tarantola is available freely online.
Yes, absolutely. You're right. I should have mentioned it is available. Absolutely. Yes.
On slide number 20, you have mentioned 10 to the power 7 parameters. What do you mean by parameters here?
That's number 20.
Yes.
No,
Wrong direction, yes.
oh, parameters. In the case of numerical polynomial, just the number of numerical quantities which determine the initial state of the flow. Quantities was temporal evolution will be computed by the model. This is the number. That's it. So these parameters are the meteorological fields, temperature, two components of the horizontal winds, humidity at all grid points within the volume of the atmosphere, plus surface pressure at all grid points at the surface of the planet, plus a number of other parameters, for instance, humidity content of the soil, which content in secondary components of water, but also from ozone and things. So this is what I mean parameter, simply the description of the initial state.
So it's 10 quantities, but measured at the mesh, which is covering the surface.
What do you say?
So it is 10 quantities or so
Yes.
observed or measured at the points of a mesh.
Yes, but they don't observe the point of the mesh. They observe, as I showed, for instance, the geographical distribution is very rich, especially for synoptic observations. Yes. Secondly, many of the observations, not the scientific observations, are actually, yes, I did not say site full expression, I mentioned it for oceanographical observations, are actually not point-wise measurements in the atmosphere, but actually integrals over a path, integrals of some quantity. It's a lot of the case for GPS measurements. Integral, basically, of temperature and humidity along the path of the ray, which goes from the emitter to the receiver. So many measurements, and more, are actually integrals of some quantity or some quantities along the path.
So then, obviously not necessarily the quantities that you're evolving in the model. Another question is, I think you also implied uncertainty in physical parameters, or even the physics, the model. And when you showed the first picture, maybe on slide number 2, where you showed these different synoptic maps,
Yes.
some of them were uncertainties in the initial data, but some of them I thought were uncertainties or changes in the actual physics. Is that correct?
Yes. You mean, okay. Come back to first.
Yes.
Yes, in that case, that's why I keep it from presentation, 1993. The intensity was only in the initial condition. The model, which was used for producing this 32 forecast, as a model, was exactly the same, only the initial condition. So this exactly shows sensitivity to initial condition. And that's why I still did it. Now ECNWF is in its ensemble prediction system. There is not only the initial condition, but also a number of, they have introduced what they call stochastic physics, which is meant to represent the certainty in the physical evolution of the field. And in that case, both effects are present. So what's so I represent two pictures. Yes?
Could you expand a little bit on that? I just thought that there were the initial connections. I mean, what do you mean? How do you actually change the physics? You can't change the law. So what do you mean?
Changing the physics.
Yeah, how do you change the physics?
Well, there are many ways to do it. Actually, I don't know exactly how the ECNWF is doing it and is doing it now. They call it stochastic physics. And I'm not absolutely sure it is actually stochastic, where there are actually random numbers, actually raw random numbers in the production. What they vary are parameters which are introduced into the model, which are considered as being uncertain. Parameters are discrete. For instance, the model is discretized to some length, 16 kilometers. There are motions which are not explicitly resolved by the model, but these motions have an impact on the motion as a So, and of course, has to be taken into account. So, there is a numerical scheme which is meant to describe that, with parameters which are not, which don't have a perfectly defined value. These are parameters which are meant to represent the statistical effect of a process with statistics of turbulence, which is still largely, the understanding of which is still very weak, very limited. So it is necessary to use coefficients which are meant to represent a stochastic process whose basic law was governed by stochastic laws, but are not known. This is typically an example of an uncertain parameter. Although I don't think they actually perturb that of those parameters. They just add perturbation in the evolution. They take the evolution equation, add. Yes.
So just a question of terminology. Is there a difference between parameters and variables, or is that used interchangeably?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Normally, yes. Normally, the word parameter is used preferentially to designate those quantities in the numerical model which are part of the model itself, of the simulator, typically the one that I was mentioning, I was just mentioned. And it is true for physical quantities like pressure or temperature. One may use preferentially the word variable, but not absolutely systematic. And here in that sentence, I said so many parameters to be determined. Like these are most parameters are physical quantities which describe pressure, temperature, wind, humidity, and so on. But yes, parameters is used preferentially for designated numerical quantities in the model as a simulator of the flow, independently of the present situation. Okay, so in the next lecture, I describe briefly some example of Bayesian estimation and say that, well, fully Bayesian estimation would be totally impossible in our programs. We have to reduce our ambitions to things which are more easily implemented.
Thank you.